The unsolved murder of David Buehler. Imagine a quiet night in downtown Toronto, a bustling art school, and a professor with a passion for his craft. But in January of 2001, a brutal murder shattered the tranquility of the University of Toronto, leaving the community in shock and a killer at large. David Buehler was a respected professor, beloved by his students, dedicated to his art. But one evening he was found stabbed in his own office. The motives unknown and the suspect nowhere to be found. Over 2 decades later, his murder remains one of Toronto's most haunting cold cases. Was it a personal vendetta, a random act of violence, or something even darker? Join us as we explore the theories, the evidence, and the lingering questions surrounding David Buehler's tragic death. Explore the unsolved mysteries of Canada with our captivating true crime podcast, Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. As we piece together the evidence and follow the trail of clues, we invite you to become a part of our mission to solve these perplexing cases. New episodes available every Sunday. David Buehler was murdered at his desk at the University of Toronto's Visual Studies Department at 1 Spadina Crescent. On January 18, 2001, he was stabbed repeatedly and died in his office, to be found by a caretaker the next day. The art community and the faculty were shaken by the sudden and violent loss. At 50 years old, David was a respected professor, known for his thoughtful approach to art and his dedication to his students. His colleagues described him as quiet yet passionate, an artist and teacher with a warm heart and a keen mind. He was deeply involved in the art scene in Toronto and had dedicated much of his life to his students and his craft. As an artist, Buehler had an impressive body of work that spanned various mediums, including painting, drawing, and photography. His work often reflected his introspective nature, and he wasn't afraid to tackle complex, even controversial subjects. Those close to him described him as a deeply thoughtful and sensitive person with profound dedication to art and a strong commitment to social justice. He had a unique way of looking at the world, often finding beauty and meaning in places others might overlook. His art reflected these qualities, frequently exploring themes of identity, society, and human vulnerability. At the school, David was known as a dedicated professor who took a genuine interest in his students' lives and artistic journeys. He was approachable and empathetic, always willing to lend an ear and provide thoughtful guidance. Former students described him as patient, wise, and encouraging. A teacher who could see potential, even in work that others might dismiss. His colleagues appreciated his quiet nature and deep intellect and became a steady presence within the school. Beyond his work, Buehler is actively engaged in Toronto's art scene. He participated in local exhibitions, connected with other artists, and maintained a network of creative individuals who shared his values and visions. Those who knew him recall his dry sense of humor, his love for intellectual conversations, and his deep commitment to his craft. His life was one of purpose and reflection, dedicated to the pursuit of beauty and understanding in a world that could often seem indifferent. David was also instrumental in developing an innovative interdisciplinary master's program in visual studies at the university, which was going to begin the following year. Buehler's murder left an irreplaceable void in the lives of his family, friends, colleagues, and students. For those who knew him, the loss was more than just a tragic end of a promising life. It was the silencing of a voice that championed creativity, empathy, and thoughtfulness. The setting seemed too familiar, too ordinary to house such a horrific act of violence. Crown Police launched a full investigation, but despite their efforts, Buehler's case remains unsolved over 2 decades later. Up next, the day of the murder. The day of the murder. This episode is brought to you by Nickel Investigations. The murder took place in the middle of a busy Thursday afternoon when the building was teeming with students and staff. Shortly before his death, Bueller had launched a webpage featuring what he termed homoerotic icons. Last time Bueller was seen alive was by a student inside 1 Spadina Crescent at about 1 p.m., Thursday, January 18th, 2001, the last day of his life. Other reports state that David was speaking to a female colleague at the Sidney Smith building at that time, which is 1 block north and 1 block east of David's office. At 1:09 p.m., we know David returns to his office. We know this because the computer in his office starts up. Police were able to take his computer and analyze the hard drive data to see the last actions on it. We know it was David because at 1:10 p.m., he uses his office phone to call the same female professor he was seen speaking with. We assume she doesn't answer because David leaves a voicemail for her. The exact contents of the voicemail are not mentioned, but it's stated that it is all strictly related. Not long after that, there was a baby shower attended by about a dozen people a floor down from his office. Now, a couple of sources stated that there was a retirement party going on at this time, while other sources stated that it was a baby shower. And some sources stated that there was upwards of 100 people at this party, while other sources stated it was maybe 8 to 10 people. But regardless, safe to say that some sort of party was taking place below David's office on the first floor. There was multiple people in attendance. At approximately 1:30 p.m., several people at the party stated they heard a loud altercation taking place on the floor above them that lasted only a couple seconds. They couldn't distinguish what was being said or if the voices were masculine or feminine, but that shortly after the altercation they heard what was described as a thud. It seems to be the end of whatever disturbance they heard, and they essentially carried on their party until about 1:45 p.m. when people started to leave and clean up. 1:58 p.m., we know that whoever's on David's computer, whether it be him or someone else, looking at a painting. At 2:02 p.m., the user of the computer opens Apple Works and doodles a drawing. At 2:21, however, the image is saved to the hard drive of David's computer. This is where things starting to get a little weird because at 2:24 p.m., the image is actually printed to David's office printer, but it's not quite the same image anymore. The printed version contains a 6-worded phrase that police have withheld from the public and can continue to this day. This phrase they feel is pertinent to the case and that is a direct association to the murder. I believe one detective worded it as being a motivating factor in the murder. Weirdly enough, the words were added to the image, and then the image was printed. The image was not then resaved to the hard drive with the changes. And at 2:25 p.m., the plug of David's computer pulled out of the power socket, and the computer shuts off. Now there is no other activity that can be traced until about 4 p.m. Bueller was scheduled to teach classes at 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. that day. He was never absent for his lectures or even late. The students said something was wrong when he missed both classes that Thursday afternoon with no explanation. Students were baffled and alarmed by the killing, especially those who arrived for his 4 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. classes Thursday evening. 10 students from the 6:30 p.m. class waited for 30 minutes in their studio classroom before knocking on his office door to no avail. His body was found around 6:30 a.m. Friday morning by a cleaning woman when she went to his office. Up next, the investigation. The investigation. This episode is brought to you by Nickel Investigations. David Bueller was stabbed and slashed to death in his tiny second-floor office in the University of Toronto's Visual Studies Department, in the mixed-use Connaught Medical Sciences building the western edge of the campus at 1 Spadina Crescent, north of College Street. Seeing the murder was what longtime homicide investigator Inspector Ken Taylor called a very quiet death scene. There's no evidence of a break-in. He was likely at his computer sitting on his chair writing when the killer came in during the school day, January 18th, 2001. He was stabbed repeatedly in the torso, and as he fell from his chair, his body hit the computer cord and pulled out the plug. He said the attacker surprised Bueller. The chair tipped over with the computer cord wrapped around it. The plug was torn from the wall. This would be at 2:25 p.m. The party below wrapped up at about 1:45 p.m. The altercation heard by party members taking place on the floor above them was around 1:30 p.m. At 1:09 p.m., David logged into his computer in his office. 1:10 p.m., we know David made a phone call. 1:58 p.m., someone was looking at a painting on David's computer. 2:00 p.m., Apple Works is opened. Someone begins doodling. At 2:21 p.m., the image is saved to the hard drive on David's computer. At 2:24 p.m., the image is printed on David's office printer, but now a 6-worded phrase was added. 2:25 p.m., the computer cord is pulled from the wall. At this point, it's assumed that David was killed. There was no DNA or murder weapon found. No blood was found on the handles of his office doors or any doors in the building. There were no video cameras in the building then. The closest surveillance camera at the time was at College and Spadina Avenues. Nobody had cameras then, Taylor said. The crime scene was pristine, says Taylor, and the robbery was ruled out as a motive. The killer knew where he was going and likely knew him. At the time of his murder, his computer had been printing out artwork of 2 males facing each other. One of the men in the photos wore glasses like Bueller. The identity of the other man remains a mystery. His latest paintings were homoerotic, but the computer-drawn sketch that lay in his printer baffled police. It was of 2 men, one man naked with his arms tied above his head, the other man smiling, wearing glasses. This figure was thought to be Bueller, being printed just minutes before his murder. Taylor said the image or what led to the drawing of the image. This, I believe, is the motive for the murder. We believe he was killed as a result of this, but we don't know why. Someone, and police are not sure if it was Bueller or his murderer, opened Bueller's Mac laptop, sketched the drawing found on the printer. However, the image on his computer was not the same as the image printed. The printed image had words on it the police call significant, but will not release, hoping they will help nail down the suspect should one arise. The version with words was never saved because Bueller collapsed from his chair onto the floor, pulling out the computer plug. The crime is extremely violent and passionate, but also calculated. David was stabbed 9 times, but his office, a pretty small space, was relatively undisturbed. He had a card sitting upright in a filing cabinet by the office door, and that card was still sitting upright the next morning when David's body was found. One stab wound was sort of the back left shoulder, and the rest were to the upper body and chest area. The amount of blood at the scene, investigators immediately requested luminol testing for every doorknob in the building. They believe with this amount of blood, there was no way that the killer couldn't have left some sort of trail. Shockingly enough, though, none of the surface tested throughout the entire building reacted with any of the blood indicating tests, not a single one. Stabbing someone is a very close contact attack. It would be impossible to not get blood in yourself or your clothing, your hands or your shoes. With cast-off flinging all over the place, if you're stabbing somebody multiple times, there should be blood somewhere on the perpetrator. But with no blood in any knobs, that's sort of indicative of protective gear of some sort. The wound suggested that David's attacker was standing behind him when he was stabbed, likely stabbing him in the shoulder, and proceeding to stab him in the chest area. One of the original investigators was perturbed by the fact that David seemingly didn't put up a fight. The medical examiner explained that with the wounds that David suffered, he would have had approximately 2 minutes before bleeding out. In that time, doesn't appear that David reacted or attempted to fight off his attacker in any way. It really puzzled the investigator. He felt that after the first stab, there should have been some sort of struggle. Because he was out and gay, there was an immediate assumption by many that he was likely the victim of a hate crime. Inspector Taylor dismisses that theory. "We don't think David's murder was a result of a hate crime," Taylor said. The person who killed David definitely knew him. In the days and weeks that followed, a lot of people assumed that David's murder must have been connected to his sexuality in some way. So the police had to investigate that angle, but also remain open to all possibilities. I think that was very challenging. Murder investigators sifted through messages and images, Bueller's work and personal computers. Taylor even went undercover on a gay sex chat line. In the year following Bueller's death, police interviewed 230 people associated with personal and professional life, and RCMP computer experts examined his computers for clues. The individuals suggested as Bueller's possible killer included a disgruntled student, jilted lover, a homeless man who had wandered up Spadina Avenue from the Scott Mission. But no evidence was found to back up any of those theories, or the one that suggested Bueller, who was gay, led a risky lifestyle that may have instigated the attack. Taylor asked psychologists and retired cops for insights and suggestions. They presented the case at police case conferences, in case investigators from somewhere else had insights. Checked across Canada to see if there were similar attacks on professors. He took their questions to the gay village. "Everybody would help," Taylor said. "I've asked people to second guess us. Everybody gave 100%. The gay community was wonderful with us. Everybody gave the effort. It was not for lack of effort from anyone." Building at 1 Spadina Crescent is one of the oldest on campus, on the western fringe of the campus and surrounded by streetcar lines. Completed in 1875, it was first known as Knox College, Presbyterian Theology School. Church-like neo-Gothic building with its spires and peaks was designed by architect James Avon Smith, who also designed Church of the Redeemer, Bloor Avenue Roads, and at least 90 other churches across the province. During the First World War, it was called Spadina Military Hospital. Its volunteers included a teenage Amelia Earhart. Before she became the world-famous aviator who vanished in 1937 while flying over the Pacific Ocean. Later used for teaching veterans work skills, medical research labs, an eyeball bank, storage for low-level radioactive waste, campus parking office, and offices and classes for fine arts and Ukrainian studies, and The Independent, a student newspaper. Somehow Bueller's killer managed to make his or her way out of the crowded building without attracting notice. Perhaps the murderer fled down the main stairs and out the front door, or perhaps he or she took other stairs that led to a door on the eastern side of the building. There were also emergency exits. One led to the roof, the other led downstairs. No emergency alarm was set off. Perhaps the killer hid somewhere in the building until fewer people were around, and then left. Up next, theories. Theories. This episode is brought to you by Nickel Investigations. An angry student or a jealous or angry faculty member. Both present strong motives. First, we'll deal with the student. Prior to David's death as well, it was mentioned that there was a student who had attended the university, taken David's course, among other professors' courses, and was a bit of a troublemaker. Previous students at David's that were interviewed stated that the student often interrupted lectures by yelling negative comments. One account stated that the student brought a knife to class and paced the back of the classroom with it in hand. The next, a faculty member. The scene doesn't speak to a random, spur-of-the-moment attack, but rather a plan to a calculated and knowledgeable attack. This person was either extremely close to David enough to know his schedule on a day-to-day basis, or they were stalking him to some degree. This person put a certain level of planning into his murder. This does not have the markings of a spontaneous killing. The person arrived at a very public building in the middle of the week on a Thursday, armed with a knife. A close friend of David's named Andrew Ward had stated that David confided in him about some troubles at work. While not many details about the issues were shared, it did sound like there was some sort of conflict between David, possibly two other faculty members. Who they were, their field of work, or the conflict is unknown. We don't know much about the alleged conflict between David and the faculty member, or members he was allegedly having issues with. Some sources stated it could be related to the new master's program that David was helping spearhead, and possible promotion in the future. Without David around, it's possible whoever this person was would have greatly benefited from his absence. When I walked the stairs of the college by his office after David was murdered, I realized the stairs were old and creaky and loud. I also realized that unless you knew exactly where David's office was located, it would have been impossible to find it. This just points once again to the strong likelihood that the murderer was known to David and familiar with the One Spadina building. Certainly not the only person who believes that David Buehler knew his killer, and the murderer was definitely familiar with the building. They made their way through the building, located the office, and was able to gain access without breaking in, which indicates that David must have been expecting them, or was comfortable enough to allow them in. I don't think it was out of the realm of possibility. This was a planned murder. Perhaps the killer was at the baby shower or retirement party. It's also possible the killer did come in through a different entrance, as some doors were known to be propped open by smokers. They wouldn't be locked out. But it would be someone who, if seen, would not be questioned why they were in the building. That leads to students or faculty. A party where anyone could use the excuse of going to the washroom or out for a smoke and wander away for a short period of time, or a student working on a project. Likely someone already had a gym bag or similar bag or briefcase either with them or sitting in an office. The time the altercation was heard at 1:30 p.m. by the party doesn't line up with the time the computer cord was pulled from the wall, as David fell over in his chair as he was being murdered at 2:25 p.m. The party wrapped up at 1:45 p.m. People were leaving and cleaning up. At 1:58 p.m., someone was looking at a painting on David's computer. Was David still alive at this point? Sure seems so. After the party had ended, someone from the party come up to David's office. Timeline certainly fits. But for nearly an entire half hour, someone seems to be in the office with David, 1:58 p.m., at the time of his apparent murder, at 2:25 p.m. Or did someone come in just after the image was saved to David's hard drive at 2:21 p.m., stab David, add the words to the image, and print the image at 2:24? Neither push a dying David over in his chair, pulling out the cord, or David fell over himself as he died. The thud was heard at 1:30 p.m. by partygoers downstairs, preceded by a brief yelling altercation. One would assume that more than likely that was the assault and chair falling to the floor. Now, if that is true, that means that all the activity after that would not have been David, but rather his killer. White killed a man, then proceeded to draw a very seemingly random image on his computer, saving, then add a 6-word phrase to it, then print and leave the image on the printer. One can really only speculate at that point. But investigators felt it was essentially the key motive to the killing. It really makes you wonder what the phrase could have been. We then now have to consider the thud in the altercation was accurately heard at 1:30. Sounds like partygoers were pretty confident that it is about the time that they heard it. But if it's not the time of death, then did David remain in his office with his killer until shortly before 2:30 after having an altercation of some sort? Was this an argument about the drawing? Was this a collaboration with another artist that turned into a violent altercation? If that were true, that would also mean that this person just casually arrived at his office with a knife. That seems to be far-fetched. It all leads back to premeditation. This conflict, whether one-sided or two, was brewing at some point prior to his death, and this perpetrator to come to David's office prepared to stab him and leave no mess behind. Another notch on the faculty member's side of things, whether there was a particular staff member alleged to have been in conflict with David or something prior to his death. The faculty member worked in the same building and was there that day conducting interviews every 20 minutes in their own office, one floor above David's. The person would have had access to the building, lend him being a staff member with a reason to be there, and would have a place to sort of hide out or change or whatever after murdering David. Being in art school, there were numerous smocks around that were accessible. Someone could easily remove what they were wearing and cover themselves up with a smock. Taking a knife from the bag, they would walk to David's office and murder him. Any blood would be contained to the smock. Back to where they left the bag, wrap the knife in the smock, change into the clean clothes, and place the smock and knife back in the bag, and take it outside to their car, and either go right back to the party or drive away and dispose of the bag on their way home. Colleague. The person who murdered David, someone who knew him better than the faculty member. The person would only have to know where David would be Thursday afternoon, but know where his office was. Either they had plans with David to meet at his office, or knew that if they showed up unexpectedly, David would welcome them into his office with open arms. The person would have had known he had no other meetings or places to be in the immediate time after his death as well. The person probably knew he didn't have class until 4 p.m., and therefore had a few hours before anyone would even come looking for David. And if David was in fact murdered at the time the thud was heard at 1:30, the person would have had to have been familiar enough with David's laptop and his artwork enough to know how to work his computer and recreate a drawing that could pass as David's work. Being that David had in recent time, before his death, started incorporating text into his image and paintings, this person had to have known that a lot of the homoerotic images that David used in his art were photographs. I don't know if there were photographs taken by him or a colleague or a friend of photography, but if they were, this person would know that David's newer art looked a certain way and could imitate it. I feel that more than likely, the image on the computer was used as sort of a red herring. I think while words may be of significance, the image is meant to confuse and throw off the investigation, in that the words were added hastily after the image was saved and then printed. I do not believe David created the image. Is David's killer a close confidant in his inner circle? Very close. Someone we call a friend. Someone familiar with his art as well. Not like a fan, maybe even someone he bounced ideas off or possibly collaborated with. Up next, today. Today, Karen Sanlos often replays the horrific days immediately after Uncle David Bueller was murdered in his office at the University of Toronto. His killer have also been one of the so-called friends who reach out to comfort her and her family as they grieved. It is a chilling realization, but I believe the person who killed David was very much in his circle, possibly in mine as well, Sanlos said. David was a person who compartmentalized his life, and to keep his personal life and his professional life pretty separate, Sanlos said. Sanlos got on with her life after her uncle's murder. She still mourns. Followed a similar career path, moving to Chicago to become a professor of art and education, School of Art and Art History at the University of Illinois. I never got to tell him that, she said. Looking back to my childhood, I have such distinct early memories of David's paintings. He made these huge abstracts that were all about color and movement and emotion. He taught me about living with art, being part of a community of creative people, artists, writers, thinkers. David was a careful, thoughtful person. He also took risks in his life and work. He was an out gay man at a time when LGBTQ sexuality was far less acceptable than it is today. From David's example, I learned that pursuing my own interests and passions would be worth the struggles that come with that. Sanlos and Inspector Taylor each say they haven't given up hope that the crime will someday be solved. Perhaps Killer will finally be moved by conscience. He said she's comforted somewhat by her uncle's final painting titled History Counsels Patience. That phrase was taken from the poem Loneliness by W.H. Auden, which is also embedded in the painting. The poem includes the phrase, gate-crashing ghost, aggressive, invisible visitor. Sanders prefers to focus on Auden's phrase, history counsels patience. Keep those words on a card above the desk where I sit every day, and I've read them multiple times a day, she said. He would have wanted us to get on with our lives, but I think he would have also wanted us to keep believing the truth will come out in time. Bueller's legacy as a teacher carries on in the master's program in visual studies he helped to design, and in the David Bueller Memorial Scholarship, which each year provides funds to deserving incoming master's students. Thank you for listening. This has been Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast, available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.